Hey guys, this is Mark, and in today's podcast, I'm going to be interviewing Michael Yankin. He was one of my group members. He's done the ASD Men's Q&A group. He graduated on to do the ASD Men's Masterclass, and we want to pick his brain today about what he learned and how he applied it. So I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. So let's head on over to the computer and talk to Michael. I want to welcome to the podcast Michael Yankin. Michael, thanks for joining today. I'm excited to talk to you. Now, you did the ASD Men's Masterclass, and before that, you did the Q&A. And I think we started working together one degree or another about 18 months ago, I believe. And you're 38, right? Years old.
That's right.
Father of two boys.
Yep.
And I have to tell you up front that you are definitely one of my star pupils, if I can be so bold as to use the term pupil. So, first question I would like to ask you is, and we don't have to get too personal. If it does, just let me know. What brought you to do the ASD Men's Q&A group, which was the first thing that you did?
Yeah, so it was actually suggested several years ago that I had ASD or might have ASD, and I kind of like poo-pooed it when I first heard it. And pretty much the reason I did that was I've known that we've had issues, in our marriage, but I didn't want to blame those issues on something like a condition or something like that. So I didn't do any research into ASD or really know much about it, but I kind of just pushed it off. And then several years later, actually, my wife, Emily, kind of started, poking at me again, like, hey, I really think you should learn a little bit more about ASD, like, some of these traits I think, you have. And that's really what pushed me to kind of get serious and kind of take a look at it.
Okay. And there is, and I'm going to generalize here, there's usually three things that I run into. The guy that does a little informal quiz online, and he goes, no, I don't have any of those traits. And as he's discussing things with his NT wife, he will say, it's actually, you're the problem. And he has no interest in getting an assessment or doing any kind of groups or whatever. That's the kind of person that I can't work with, and nor would I want to. Then there's the other individual that looks at an informal online quiz and goes, yeah, you know what? I do have some of those traits, and it is causing a problem in the marriage. I don't know if I have ASD level 1 necessarily, but I definitely have some of those traits, and I care about my marriage, and so I want to do something about it. And then there's generally speaking, the third category, where he wants to go get an assessment just so he'll know for sure. And then when he gets an assessment and they go, yes, by gosh, you do have ASD level 1, he goes, oh, so revelation, it's not a downer. He goes, okay, great. Now that explains why I have had so many challenges in the social and emotional world. It explains all the obstacles that were so difficult for me to overcome. And so he doesn't view this as some kind of shameful disease or whatever. He recognizes that thousands and thousands of other people have it. We're on the programmable computer right now, Bill Gates. Some people have heard of Elon Musk. Some people don't like him. Some people do. It doesn't matter. He is smart as a whip. And so they realize that there's really no shame involved here. I'm glad I know what I have, because now I know what my strengths are likely to be and what weaknesses are likely to be that I'll need to be worked on.
So
speaking of shame, Michael, do you want to?
Well, let me say something about that.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so from my experience, it was really the second of the two that you explained is what got me. So I remember very clearly, my wife was kind of poking me, hey, learn more about ASD. And so I was on an airplane, and I had actually downloaded one of your YouTube videos. It was called like, why are ASD marriages, why can ASD marriages be so challenging, or something like that. And it was a 30-minute video. And I just remember I was listening to it, and it was like, oh, and it's like ding, 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 all the light bulb, it just started like going off, and I started getting really excited. And then I passed one of my AirPods to my wife on the airplane, and I'm like, listen, you got to listen to this. And she starts listening to it, and she's like, oh my God. So that was really like the light bulb. And just like a couple of examples of that, I can share just like a kind of what my
Sure.
light bulb was going off on.
Yeah, please do.
So I think like from a personal trait, ASD trait standpoint, you were talking about like low emotional intelligence, lack of empathy, and being super logical and task oriented. And like at the time, I didn't really even know what low emotional intelligence meant, but it resonated with me. And like lack of empathy and being super logical and task oriented, like that's me to my core, right? So I'm hearing these things and I'm very much resonating. And then there was a couple of things that you had called out on that video more related to the marriage. The first one was I think you were reading a question from a spouse, and the question was something like, why is it that my spouse was so attentive to me for the first couple months of marriage, and now they don't pay any attention to me? And you were kind of explaining how it's very common for people with ASD to have what you call special interests, right? Which is basically something that you kind of hyper focus on, that you're super attentive to, that kind of makes you feel fulfilled, kind of focusing on that. And basically what happens in the marriage is that spouse, and it doesn't, not marriage necessarily, it could be a relationship, right? That spouse for the first several months of the relationship is that, ASD person's special interest. So they are being very attentive and they are kind of doing all these things. And then after a couple months, they kind of get another special interest, right? And then that's what happened. And hearing that, it was like, yep, that's pretty much what happened in my marriage, I could say. And then the other thing I'll mention about that was,
I want to add just a little piece to that, Michael, before you move on. And that is, he's, NTY is saying, well, I was tricked. He was masking. Now, in the early going of the relationship, he wants to present well. But if we want to call wanting to present well as masking, well, both NT and ASD individuals do that. But to your point, she was his special interest. And so there was no masking going on there. He was very passionate about her. And furthermore, in the vast majority of cases, if not all cases, when he starts to lose some of the initial hyper interest in this female, somebody that he's excited to be with and very passionate about, when he starts to lose some of that initial interest in the romantic phase of the relationship, he doesn't recognize, this may or may not have been the case with you, Michael, he doesn't recognize that he is slowly at an unconscious level drifting away. And she notices, and it's like, wait a minute, we had sex, we had affection, give and take in conversation, did things together, all this and this and that, and what happened? And he's kind of confused. It's like, I thought we were okay. I mean, what do you mean, what happened? And I don't know, she may say something like, well, we used to do things together, now we don't. We used to have give and take in conversation, now we don't. We used to have, used to be empathic and now you're preoccupied. And now she starts labeling. He's insensitive, uncaring, selfish, narcissistic, work's more important to him than me. And her heart's in the right place. She's trying to pull him back into the relationship, but her message is an anxiety producer for him. So what ends up happening, instead of pulling him back in to the original emotional reciprocity, the end result is he drifts away even more, but now at a conscious level. He's now feeling anxious by these conversations, starting to feel like a failure, starting to feel like I'm always on the receiving end of disapproval, and he starts pulling away even more. So
yeah, well, I think for me, probably that's what was happening. What I'll say is, I didn't understand that I was walking around with the emotional intelligence of a 12-year-old, right? So it's like, I kind of knew that I had shifted my focus, or, like kind of was not being as attentive or doing those things. And I think you mentioned, felt that, like, I felt like a failure about it. I felt some shame about that. Like, I knew that there was a problem, but I didn't know what was going on, and I didn't have the tools to understand or to fix it. So that's what happened,
Mm-hmm. Michael, in that first session of the men's masterclass, we talked about the difference between being passive on one end of the spectrum or aggressive on the other end of the spectrum. And so passivity would be some version of shutdown, where I'm actually intimidated by, we'll put it in the context of the NT wife. So the ASD husband has thoughts along the lines of, I'm intimidated by these difficult conversations. I'm not really sure what to say. And she's telling me how she feels, and I'm not sure exactly what I'm supposed to do based on how she feels. And I'm not even sure why she would feel that way. And so out of fear, in this case, the ASD husband will do some version of shutdown, which is, I'm not even tracking the conversation anymore. My anxiety's through the roof. I got to leave. Or on the other hand, the other extreme would be meltdown, which then now he gets defensive. He goes on the attack. Would you say in those most difficult times with Emily, were you more of a shutdowner or a meltdowner?
Well, I would say first comes the shutdown, then comes the meltdown.
Okay.
And that's pretty much how it always went. So it would be something like, she would say something or do something, and I would download that in a certain way, right? And then, of course, as I mentioned, having low emotional intelligence, when I downloaded what she said, it would cause emotions in me, right? And I wouldn't know how to process these emotions. I would get overwhelmed, and then I would kind of shut down. And I would then stew for anywhere from a couple of days to, a week or more, kind of in my mind, like going on, who knows where I would go with all of this stuff. And she said this and she did that, and all of me kind of downloading it. And then it would typically end, again, in a couple of days to a week, with me having a meltdown, which would look like me kind of aggressively throwing up all of my stuff, right, towards her. And then, of course, when I did that, like, I would feel good because I got it all out. But, obviously being able to look back and see kind of what has happened, she really got the short end of the stick on that, right? Because she would go from, saying or doing something that had nothing was even wrong with it, to being ignored for a week, and then to be, aggressively, mean to, right? And yeah, so those meltdowns were like super common for many years, right, in my relationship. And it was funny, I was actually talking to Emily about this the other day, and she was just like, yeah, you haven't had a meltdown in a long time. And it's true, like, and it's like, that's been nice.
One thing that you mentioned was, and this happens a lot, is when I'm going to speak of a generic ASD husband now, that may or may not apply to you, Michael. He, from childhood, couldn't quite fit in, and maybe was teased, bullied, maybe labeled a problem child by parents, problem student by teachers, was on the receiving end of disapproval a lot as a child. Grows up, falls in love with his NT wife. She's his special interest. He unconsciously gravitates to some other special interest. She starts complaining, and why wouldn't she? Now he's on the receiving end of disapproval yet again. So he has super, super, super low self-esteem. And I want to tie that into session 2, Michael. As you may remember, we talked about self-condemnation versus self-compassion. So when you first started being on the receiving end of disapproval from your wife, was there some self-talk that you had that was very much self-critical?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that self-talk was common for me in our relationship very much, but really in all aspects of my life, like looking back, right? Even professionally, for example, definitely the low self-confidence, since I can remember, makes you super sensitive to any type of feedback, you know? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there's so much going on when your wife is trying to tell you that you're not meeting her needs, and she doesn't really know that how to communicate it effectively, and you don't know how to take that, and yeah, you are blaming yourself. But that actually reminds me, and it might have been in session 2, learning about kind of self-compassion versus self-condemnation, and understanding that folks with ASD are more prone to self-condemnation. Mm-hmm. I don't remember exactly what it was, but I was like explaining a situation to you that was common for me, and you like very, I mean, not nonchalantly, but very much were like, I think that's toxic shame, you know? Mm-hmm. And when you said that, I would say like that was probably one of the most 5 impactful things anyone's ever said to me, because as I learned about toxic shame, which is basically like, toxic shame is basically like you think that you are a mistake, mm-hmm. right? So anytime you make a mistake or someone implies that you might have made a mistake, you immediately you don't say like, I made a mistake and it's okay. You immediately go to, I am a mistake. Mm-hmm. And for me, what that's done pretty much my entire life has been not being able to receive any type of constructive criticism, feedback, anything, and really catastrophized many, many situations. Mm-hmm. And like we could do an entire hour-long talk about toxic shame, but just to call out, like, I think you mentioned it is common for folks with ASD.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and I can say for me personally, like, again, on this journey that I've been on, identifying that I had toxic shame was another like ding, ding, ding light bulb, and then learning more about it. And there's many layers to peel, to kind of get through that. But like, if you can identify that you have toxic shame as a start and kind of start down that path, like for me, that, in my opinion, that was like super impactful to learn about that and how it was controlling me, and mm-hmm. that I'm not a mistake, right? And I do make mistakes sometimes, and that's okay. And so that was big.
Yeah, and we want to make mistakes. I know it sounds odd to say. Why would we want to make mistakes? Because we don't learn from situations where there's no challenges. When you go to school, you're learning new material that's you're unfamiliar with, and you're doing tests and you're getting some things wrong. And so there's the little thing called neuroplasticity, where you go, okay, well, I thought this was going to work. It didn't. So I want to try this, and that didn't work. So I'm going to try this, and that worked. So now your brain has literally rewired some circuits towards success. So we don't get to success without mistakes. But back to toxic shame again. When in this case, the ASD spouse does not get proactive about finding their areas of challenge and working on those, they are going to, by default, feel like a failure, feel like they're defective and flawed, and they're going to be super, super sensitive, to use your term, to constructive criticism. Sometimes the NT wife's neutral comments download to him as an attack, which now erodes the marriage even more. Trust starts hitting rock bottom. Both parties don't feel safe in the relationship. And to play this thing out to its worst case scenario, she moves on to start having Cassandra syndrome symptoms, and he spends most of his time trying to avoid her at all costs. And I just try to do my thing over there at the other end of the house, not to rock the boat, because whenever we try to talk about something difficult, it ends in a shit show. And so I don't really want to talk about anything. And worst case scenario, and there's been many times with this, when this happens, gets to the point where the two of them can't talk about anything anymore, except maybe the weather.
Yeah.
So, but things didn't deteriorate that bad with you, Michael. So,
Well, I'll say, at the start of the 18 months ago, how sometimes in marriages after a long time, and it's like, you don't want to end up like roommates. You've probably heard that before. I would say that 18 months ago, we were roommates who didn't like each other. Like that's kind of to the point where we were at. And yeah, like you mentioned, kind of, go over here and not want to talk about anything, right? My wife would always say, like, stop hiding in your office, right? Because that's kind of what I would do. I would go do that. And then, anytime where, a conversation would come up, it would just, in my head, I would just kind of like roll my eyes and be like, how do we have to talk about this, today? So yeah, that was very much us.
Michael, we also I think it was session 3, we talked about emotional intelligence, EQ, and we looked at 3 super important attributes of high emotional intelligence. And as you recall, that was team spirit. That's where you view yourself as a team player rather than an autonomous solo player who just happens to be married. The second one is self-awareness, and this is where you recognize your thoughts and how they affect your feelings and behavior. And then the third one was impulse control, where you're able to control impulses, to control impulsive feelings and behaviors in the heat of the moment. So with respect to self-awareness, this might be a difficult question. What are some things that you know about you today that perhaps you didn't know 18 months ago?
Put me on the spot. Well, I mean, I think the list is long.
You have already mentioned one. I'm not a mistake.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I don't know. I'll have to think about that, but I do want to comment, or about the emotional intelligence and how you kind of summarized the team player and the getting to know your feelings. Like, I think when we were going over this stuff, for me, the biggest thing was to really understand that I was walking around life as a 38-year-old man with the emotional intelligence of a 12-year-old, right? Meaning that, like, I was not able to identify emotions that I didn't know what they were. I mean, like, yeah, happy or sad, like basic emotions, but, confused or anxious or unsure or, scared or something. Like, I would feel those things, but I wouldn't know how to process them. And that would just immediately make me frustrated. And I would not be able to communicate those, right? Communicate any of those feelings, which would ultimately just lead to just poor outcomes as in interactions with your spouse. So, like, for me to kind of tie that back as far as being a team player, like, what I would say is, like, the more that you learn about, or the more that I learned about, okay, I'm not a mistake. It's okay to feel emotions. What are these emotions? It's okay to vocalize these emotions. Maybe what my spouse is saying, I download that a certain way. That might not be what she meant to say. And having the kind of ability to process all of that stuff, to be able to have a conversation about it in real time without being defensive, that leads to being a team player, right? Because you're just working through whatever comes at you. And now, instead of always being on the defensive by something she says and getting immediately, frustrated and having a shutdown and a meltdown, you're able to be like, wait a second, why did you say that? What's on your mind? let's talk about it. Oh, well, that actually made me feel, could you clarify that a little bit, right? And kind of either avoiding a meltdown or shutdown period, or working through, it's not always going to be, there's always going to be things you have to work through. But that's, I would say for me, the biggest thing about the emotional intelligence is just learning about emotions and being okay, which we can have a whole hour long conversation about masking, right? Because I kind of learned that I did that for many, many years, but it all kind of ties together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that we talked about in group 2, Michael, I think we even you and I talked about it one-on-one, perhaps, is if you're not familiar with this, I'll explain it again right now, because I'm not sure if we got into this in group or not. And this is this business of using fear as a strategy for growth. And fear is actually a driving force to help us learn a lesson. So in order to use fear as a strategy for growth, we have 5 steps, Michael. The first step that happens is the negative self-talk. We'll just call that the story. I made up a story. We'll tie it into the NT spouse. She's saying these things for this reason. She's doing these things for these reasons. She's not cooperating with me for these reasons. She's accusing me of this and this and that for these reasons. So we making up a story. And it's a very negative spun story in our head. Then that results in fear. The thought comes first, then the emotion of fear comes second. Then the third step that most people on the autism spectrum have taken was then to do some version of meltdown or shutdown. But if we want to use fear as a strategy for growth, the third step has to be a reframe, which you got really good at that, Michael. The reframe is, okay, I made up a story in my head that's probably way out of alignment with reality. It struck some fear in me such that I'm melting down and shutting down, or maybe just having an adult temper tantrum. So what's really going on here? Let's use the example where she's passionate about working on an issue, and maybe she's upset, maybe she's insistent, maybe it comes off to you as she's complaining. So you could frame that as she's being parental, she's talking down to me, she's criticizing me. That would be a negative reframe, but a positive reframe that's more in alignment with reality. And that's the whole point of the reframe. We want to find something that's closer to what's really going on. A good reframe and running with this example of her complaints is she's passionate about talking about these things because the marriage is important to her. If she didn't care about me or the marriage, she wouldn't be wasting time or energy trying to talk to me about it. So we have the story, the fear, the reframe. The fourth component as to using fear as a strategy for growth is, what's the lesson? What is the lesson? The lesson might be, okay, my self-esteem is in the toilet and has been probably from childhood, and so I'm hypersensitive and I'm quick to view constructive criticism or even neutral comments as an attack. And I have learned that I overreact, I assess the thing poorly, and then I overreact poorly based on my poor assessment. So now we have the lesson, and then the fifth and final is the growth factor. Okay, so how have I grown given the lesson? The lesson being I'm downloading things off base, I'm reacting to things based on my faulty download. What's the growth factor? I can actually hang in for these difficult conversations. I've developed some emotional muscles such that I can hang in for these difficult conversations and be a team player. So that's how we can use fear as a catalyst to growth.
Yeah, so I think if you meaning who's ever listening to this, or an ASD, someone who relates, if you are in a position where you can do that, that's awesome. For me, it took a lot of work to get to that point of, you've got to address your toxic shame, for example. You have to get into a mindset where you aren't always being defensive. And that actually reminds me, and this is, I don't want to say off topic, but it just kind of goes back to the basics of me actually, initially understanding that there was more viewpoints than just mine, right? And that's a little embarrassing to say, but so I think this was also on, where was this? It was on one of your videos, and you give an example of two, let me think, what was that? You give an example of how you're talking about how ASD people with a common ASD trait is to judge situations based on the outcomes instead of the intentions. That's common. And you give this great example of two people skiing down a mountain, right? One of those person is an expert. They always ski down this mountain. They know it in and out, right? And they get to a point on the mountain where you can either go left or you can go right. And they're trying to avoid avalanches. And so the person who's an expert there is we want to go right. This is the much safer route. There's barely ever any avalanches here. This is where we want to go. And so they go right, and wouldn't you know it, there was an avalanche, right? Now, the person that's skiing, the kind of the guest in that situation, if that person had ASD, they would be more likely to judge that friend negatively based on the outcome of the situation, which was that there was an avalanche, because there was an avalanche, right? But if you don't, it's less common if the person did not have ASD or have that ASD trait, it would be more likely that they would continue to judge that person based on their intention, which was, my intention was, I know what I'm doing. I want us both to be safe. This is the path that we go down, And so just for me, that was kind of the start of me understanding that yes, I'm very, very, very logical. And this is this, but that's not it, right? There's a whole nother side of things that, have to do with emotions and feelings and all of these. So it doesn't tie exactly, but kind of just the point is you have to be able to understand that before you can get to the point where you're able to kind of follow these 4 or 5 steps of the framework you just talked about. Because if you don't even know to your, that there are multiple ways to interpret a situation, it's going to be really hard for you to reframe something. Right.
Also, I want to tie this back into the Ms. Masterclass because you're an inspiration to you were the inspiration to the other men in the class that you attended. You'll be an inspiration to the other guys with ASD or suspected ASD that watch this video. And one of the final points that we made in that class was, if we'll use Michael as the example here, he's making all of these improvements. He's gaining some social skills in the context of neurodiverse marriage. He's gaining some emotional muscles that he didn't have. He's applying what he's learned. He's revising as needed through the learning process. But what I want to say to all the spouses with ASD out there, if you're going to get proactive with learning some social skills and some emotional literacy, we'll use the case of an ASD husband. If you're going to go through all that work for her approval, you're in it for the wrong reason. Because now her approval, you're dependent on her approval for your self-esteem. You're dependent on her approval to wiggle your way out of toxic shame. And she's only human. I can promise you, you will be disappointed if you're going to do the hard work that Michael has done in order to get her approval. Will she benefit? Hopefully. And it's likely. I'm sure Emily benefited from the progress you made, but you can't be doing this for her. Okay? Bear in mind that if your level of peace is going to be dictated by which way the approval wind blows, you're going to be operating in the old brain. that amygdala that is going to be quickly triggered, quickly download things as an insult, and then you're going to be involved in some meltdown or shutdown. So Michael is offering his wife a better version of him, and hopefully not expecting anything in return. You don't have to comment on that, Michael, but that's the big goal. Is I'm going to go through all the hard work to learn these social skills and emotional literacy so that I'm offering my wife a better version of me, and I'm not expecting anything in return, including her to give me pats on the back and words of appreciation and acknowledgement and praise. It's great when that happens. And to the NT wives that are listening, you certainly want to voice some appreciation when he's done something right. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't enjoy appreciation. No, you should be getting appreciation from your NT wife, and you should enjoy it, but we're not shooting for that. That's just a happy byproduct if it happens.
Yeah, so I do have a lot to say about that I think would be helpful to kind of whomever's listening.
Right.
I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, at the end of the day, you have to be okay by yourself in a room looking in the mirror, right? That's all that matters. It doesn't matter what other people think, doesn't matter what other people say, that's what matters. And I learned that lesson, I think in several scenarios through during the group, as you mentioned. I would be doing things and then I would maybe get discouraged because, my spouse was not kind of seeing them the way that I would have wanted to, or appreciating it or what. But that actually brings a good point, which is something I learned also throughout the journey. And by the way, as I mentioned, my wife is the one that pushed me to learn about ASD, which is also on the top 5 nicest things anyone's ever done for me. So I greatly appreciate that. She probably did it because she was sick of dealing with my crap, but for whatever the reason is that she did it. We are all on different journeys, right? And we're all in different phases of those journeys. So, in my scenario, for example, and again, we could have another hour long about Cassandra syndrome, right? But let's just, for the sake of time, say, Cassandra syndrome is where typically, the neurotypical spouse, after being ignored and rejected and emotional needs not being met for many years chronically, starts to get sick, right? That's like Cassandra syndrome. And so you can imagine how, in my case, right, so 15 years of me and my spouse in this relationship, and I'm kind of going through the motions, but never meeting her emotional needs or anything like that, right? So here we are now in 2021, and I'm learning all of these things, and it's great, right? And I'm having wins. I'm, changing the outcome, small wins, changing the outcomes of the situation because I communicated more clearly, whatever, and I'm feeling good about it. And then my spouse isn't necessarily reacting the same way. Now, in the immediate term, I can be a little bit discouraged that she's not feeling that way. But if you look at it from her standpoint, she's had 15 years of being, pummeled, ignored, and rejected, right? She's in a way different place than me. And she might not be in a place she could have so much resentment built up from those 15 years that she's not in a place to give me praise, Right. So I think there's just a lot going on there. About, and just to understand again that, with someone with ASD traits, and for me personally, learning about this as a personal growth, right, was so awesome. But your partner and your spouse, they're on their own journey, and you don't know where you guys are going to end up, right? Like, fortunately, my wife and I, our marriage and relationship is so much better than it's ever been, but that's not always the case. And that's okay too. Right. It's like people might just be better off, going their separate ways, but back to the initial point of doing things for yourself, you do, right, want to get to that point where you understand, hey, I'm going to better myself. And if my spouse is able or not able to receive that or appreciate it or anything, that has to be okay with you.
Right. Yeah. Michael, can we look at a little clip where you were in the master class?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I wouldn't make this about you. This is about you trying to understand her feeling. That was the whole point of this exercise.
Yeah.
Understanding her feelings.
Right.
So the whole big premise here is understanding her feelings. And I wouldn't go. I would keep it right there in that ballpark.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. I appreciate that. I just say, I mean, that's like such the key is being able to not have your needs be met, or you know what I'm saying? Not like control yourself, calm, that's okay. And what we're trying to do here is smooth out, you know, what happened, make her feel better, you know, like just practice these skills, right? Supporting your spouse in a way that a neurotypical person would want to be supported if their feelings are hurt. That's what the goal is to do, right?
The goal is to understand her feelings.
Yeah.
To validate her feelings by saying, wasn't my intent, but I see it hurt anyway. That's validation.
Mm-hmm.
So now you understand her feelings using the frame of reference. You validated that if you say you're sad, then that you're sad, and I get that. And I'm not trying to say you shouldn't feel sad, you know. And then the third component is, what can I do to help?
Yeah.
So again, it's
Right.
understanding her feelings, validating those feelings, and some type of possible remedy. There may be times where there's nothing you can do, but at least you've said, is there anything I can do to help? So that's the compassion piece. That is empathy right there.
Mm-hmm.
I've listened, I've validated, and I'm offering some empathy. What can I do to help? That is emotional intelligence right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do feel just gratitude, right, that I've been able to, you know, make some improvements and have, you know, a good spouse and have met you and that has, you know, helped a lot. And yeah, if you know, if anyone out there can relate to any of these things that we've kind of talked about, and you know, use this to better your, you know, to put yourself in a better situation, like do it, you know, get up, learn more about ASD. And then, yeah, I think in closing, a couple of just lessons overall, and I would say this is just in general, you know, as I was going through this journey, I mean, there are so many layers, like you hear peeling back the onion, you know, and it's like, man, when you're trying to peel back the layers on, you know, ASD and toxic shame and past experiences of this person and past experiences of the spouse and the spouse's who they are as a person. There's just so much there. And if like you also hear, it's like people say, if I would have known it would have been this hard to start, or that it would have been like this, I would have never done it, you know.
Right.
And I can't say that about this because I certainly would have. But the point is, you know, as I started, you know, I learned all about and tried to relate as much as I could to these ASD traits. But then the next thing I did was, I think I reached out to you and I was like, can you help me? You know, and then you pointed me to kind of your core skills and your ASD or your mastermind courses. And what I did was just start from the basics and just getting wins, small wins, by implementing these techniques wherever I could, you know, and you know, 10s and 20s and 30s of these small wins, they start adding up, right? And then that's what kind of allows you to, if you were playing a video game, say like, get to the next level, right? You have to have a certain amount of wins here before and you get to the next level, and then you got to stay there for a while, and then you get to the next level, and then you'll look back. So, you know, I think the point of that is just like, you got to just start with what you know right now and just try to get some wins, and then kind of continue to learn and build on top of that. And yeah, I think the other points we kind of already talked about doing this for yourself, that's the most important thing. And then again, about you and your spouse being on separate journeys, right? And that was super important for me to kind of understand that I'm doing my thing, but is she recovering from Cassandra syndrome? Is she doing what she needs to do? Kind of where is she? I can't control that, and to understand that we're just, something I might be super excited about. She might not be in a place to see it that way for whatever reason, and that's okay.
Right. Well, it's totally cool that she has been supportive of you. She's hung in there with you. So there's something to be said about the NT wife that does her reframe, and that it could be along the lines of these traits that I'm experiencing with my husband. They do look like selfishness and insensitivity and narcissism and so on. And they hurt. They definitely hurt. But at the very least, I probably shouldn't take these things personally because he's wired differently than me. That doesn't make him hurt any less, but at least I cannot take some of these behaviors based on the traits personally. So I don't know that your wife did that, but it seems to me like at some level she probably did.
I think so. But sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and that's true. And the spouse absolutely has, can play a supportive or non-supportive role. But I do think it's important to point out, and you mentioned this to me, you kind of were like, actually, Michael, you as the ASD person, right? You have a duty and a responsibility to show up for your spouse, whether it's this spouse or your next spouse or whatever, right? And as you learn more as you become more emotionally intelligent as someone with ASD, and you grow these muscles, you have a responsibility, right? To, okay, how can I show up more emotionally for my wife and meet her needs, my spouse, right? And by doing that, you will assist her kind of in her journey, right? Because now you're starting to fulfill her. So, yes, there's a huge role for her to play to kind of understand what's going on here. But as you grow your skills as someone with ASD, you have an obligation to kind of put that into action and start filling her bucket. That's what your responsibility is,
Yeah, right. That's beautifully said. So, Michael, you have proven this thing called neuroplasticity. There's a bunch of myths out there that people with autism, their social skills can't be taught, emotional literacy can't be taught. There's nothing further from the truth, and Michael is testimony to that. Yes, even people with ASD level 1 can take advantage of neuroplasticity and learn social skills and emotional literacy. Are they ever going to be neurotypical? Hopefully not. Are they ever going to be emotionally reciprocal to the level that the NT wife wants? Probably not. But we can go from way up here where the wife is super high in social and emotional intelligence, skills, and needs, and he is way down here. That doesn't need to be. With some assistance, he can come up for sure in his social and emotional skills. And if she would lower her expectations a little bit, now you have a marriage where you're no longer miserable and you're no longer just surviving. You actually have moments of thriving. So, Michael, I want to close now, but I want to appreciate you, and I want you to consider maybe coming back at some point when you're able, and we can continue to see how you're doing and pick your brain some more. You had some beautiful insights today, so I appreciate you for being on today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Hey guys, this is Mark. Click on the join button underneath any of my videos, then click on members only videos, and then click on join. And for $9.99 a month, you'll have access to members only videos, which are excerpts from previous workshops I've conducted for NT partners, ASD partners, and the neurodiverse couple. New videos will be uploaded weekly.